How much should you spend to build your bubble app? By the end of this video, you're going to have the answer to that question. Now, the reason why I can't just give you a direct number is because the cost really should depend on a number of personal factors. Now, we at Coaching No Code Apps have run the full spectrum of service offerings over the years. Way back in the day, years ago, we offered hourly coaching, for example. We offer self-led courses. We've offered outsourced development services. And today we offer a full-blown structured coaching program, helping founders go from idea to pilot app. And so what I'm going to do is take all of that experience and insight about the different factors you need to consider, but also about pricing that comes along with all of that. Convey that to you so you can come up with the right number for you personally. Now, the very first thing you need to do is decide whether you're going to outsource the development of your bubble app or whether you're going to build it yourself. Now, you might already feel like you've made a decision, but be really careful with this because the decision you make now can have a lot of ripple effects later that you might not be aware of. So what we're going to do is compare the two loosely from a high level, but just to give you a general idea of the important factors that you really need to be considering when making this decision. So we're going to kind of plot the differences between outsourcing and self-building based on the factors that you see here on the screen. So we're going to use red for outsourcing and green for self-building. Now, keep in mind that when you're looking at outsourcing, there are going to be price variations from team to team, developer to developer, based on different factors. And with self-building, there's also going to be a lot of variation. Self-building could be taking free tutorials that you find on YouTube and building your app with those. Or it could mean going through, for example, a program like I mentioned that we offer, a fully structured coaching program where technically you're still building the app yourself, but obviously vastly different from doing it on your own. So keep that in mind. This is high level, but we'll start with cost. So with outsourcing, we're going to put the cost obviously quite a bit higher than self-building. Now with speed, we're going to put for outsourcing the speed right here at the very top. Now, this is because if you're choosing the right development team who has gone through a number of different projects, they know what they're doing, they have a lot of experience, they're probably going to be pretty systematized on the back end. They're going to have systems for pulling the exact information they need from you to get everything right, so there's not a ton of back and forth. They can just kind of bang out the development and then not have to do a ton of revisions on the back end. Obviously, that's hopefully, but that's why we're putting the speed up there. Now with self-build, we're going to put it lower, but not all the way down at the bottom. Now it can be all the way down at the bottom depending on how you're going. You know, if you're going the completely free, just finding tutorials online route, then you're going to be lower. But we'll put it a little bit higher up just so that there's a realistic kind of comparison of the different options. Now, in terms of quality, we're going to bring the outsourced quality a little bit lower and the self-build quality a little bit higher. And this one might actually surprise you because if you're thinking about outsourcing, you're generally going to assume the quality is going to be high, but there's a lot of variation. And honestly, there's even variation when it comes down to your own personal goals. I mean, what are you looking to build? Are you building an app that is enterprise level? It is going straight into a business that is already operating at scale and users' data is going to be migrated directly over? Or are you building a basic prototype? You know, so you need to also keep that in mind, but there is a ton of variation when it comes to quality when you're looking for outsourcing, so you do need to be careful about that. And then with self-building, now the reason why this one's a little bit higher is because we're making the assumption that you're really taking the time and putting in the effort to build your app correctly from the start. There's always 10 different ways to do things in development, and 9 of them are going to be wrong for you. 1 of them is going to be right. So this assumes you're making the effort to find that one right path for everything that you're building. Okay, now we're going to look over here at control. And what I'm talking about here is the control that you personally have over your app. Now, this is when we see a really, really big switch. So when you're outsourcing, your control goes way down. One of the things you need to just be comfortable with is the fact that you're going to be reliant on someone else for every single thing within your app forever if you're outsourcing. Now, a lot of people think that because we're talking about no code, that if someone else builds your app, then you could just take over it later. But this is not something I've ever seen be successful. And the reason is because in order to take over an app, you need a certain level of skill set and understanding of the app. And that skill set and understanding is developed through building the app. So taking over an app is not an easy thing to do, not something I've ever seen work. And so if you're outsourcing now, plan to outsource forever. Okay, that means being dependent on someone else to have both the knowledge about your app and the control over your app. Okay, now when you self-build, the control goes way up. Now, are you going to be able to build your app in just a few months and develop your skill set to where you're just never going to need help ever again, no matter how much you expand and scale your app? No, your skill set is going to evolve over time, but because you have that underlying understanding of your app and that foundational skill set from building the app, you can compound that over time. And so you have a lot more control. And this doesn't mean that you have to be the one building your app forever, but it does mean that you can make the decision of when and who you pay to help you handle development at a later stage, maybe when you're shifting focus to business growth, but you're not reliant on it. And the options, the flexibility, and just the power to make a decision on your own, that's really, really big and very valuable. Okay, now let's look at long-term control. And this is, I kind of jumped forward and started talking about that, but this is over the really long run. I'm talking about you launch your app and years later, when it has evolved to a point where it's no longer even recognizable compared to the first version, how much control do you have? Well, long-term control with an agency, I want it to get at least higher over time, over years and years of time. Now, the reason why is because you should be able to learn at least the lingo around your app and just relevant to the development world, which should give you a better ability to hire smarter, to manage a team, to communicate with a team, to spend the right amount of money on a team. When you're just starting out, you're really going to have no idea. You're only going to be able to look at other people's experiences if they're sharing it and if those are comparable to yours. But you want to be able to learn some of that over time so that you can just really make better decisions, right? And of course, with self-building, we're going to have this up here. And that's just because you're always going to understand your app. If you've built your app and you've evolved the app and evolved your skill set, then it doesn't matter who's on your team or who is replaced on your team over the years. You're always going to be able to make that decision yourself if you want to. Obviously, you can delegate that responsibility to someone. But this is the comparison that we're looking at and what you need to keep in mind comparing outsourcing to self-building. Okay, so for visual satisfaction, let's go ahead and connect the dots here so you can kind of see how this plays out. So that's kind of the line there for outsourcing, and here it is for self-building, okay? So in the beginning, you can see the comparison, and then those two kind of switch as you go over the long term, which that goes back to those ripple effects that I was talking about that are not always evident up front. Okay, so we're going to go through a quick overview of costs and what you should consider when outsourcing, but we're going to focus the majority of this on self-building, mostly because that's what we help people do. But if you're watching this video, you're probably very interested in that. So with outsourcing, you really need to consider three things: the time or the speed of development, the overall cost, and the quality of the app. So the rule of thumb is you can only have two of those three. So if you want an app really quickly, very quick turnaround time, and you want a really high quality app, your cost is going to go way, way up. So you're compromising on that. If you want a really cheap app and you want it turned around really quickly, well, the quality is going to go down. So that's the compromise you're making there. So the thing you need to do is just figure out your own priorities and set those expectations going in. So when you go and have conversations with developers or teams who you want to get quotes from, and one of them offers you a turnaround of your app with the same exact scope compared to an agency, but one developer is offering it for $2,000 and the agency is offering it for $20,000. And you think, well, what in the world? Like, this makes no sense. It's the same thing. Well, it's not the same thing. Okay, you have to think about the time, the speed of development, how the overall cost is going to come into play, and the quality of the app. And that's the really, really big one. Okay, the quality is where you're going to see the most variation. So when you see high quotes and you see low quotes, then that's what you need to have in your mind. Now, is that the case all the time? No, there are certainly exceptions, but go into it with that knowledge so you can make a smart decision. Okay, so let's jump over to talking about self-building your app. Now, there are 5 very personal factors that are going to influence, number one, how long it takes to build your app, which in turn influences how much it costs to build your app. Now, I want you to keep in mind that these 5 factors, you can't just look at these things individually. You have to look at them all together. So we're going to go through them. You're going to think through your own answers or your own kind of feedback to this and consider them all together. That's really important. First things first, what is the scope of the app you're building? This is pretty simple, but the bigger the app you're building, the longer it's going to take you, and therefore likely the more money it's going to cost you. Okay? So look at your scope. Now, if you've narrowed down to an MVP, first version app, pilot product, great. That's going to help you because you really want to build a skill set that coincides with a first version app, and then let those two things grow together. So you expand your skill set and your app at the same time once you've created the foundation for both. Okay, but the bigger the app, the longer it's going to take, the more it's going to cost. Number 2, how complex is the app? Now, this is different from scope. Okay, you can have a really big scope with really simple features. Complexity is looking at things like your data structure. How involved is working with data in your app, or maybe different types of calculations, API integrations, things like that. So looking at the custom functionality, if you are building an app and you have to have 5 really complex and heavy API integrations in the first version product for some reason, that's going to take you a long time to build, and it is going to cost a lot more because it's going to be tough to build a skill set that enables you to do something like that on your own. You're going to have to find help along the way. Number 3 is kind of a curveball, but how consistently and frequently are you going to commit time to building your skill set and building your app? A lot of people ask us, and I just see this question asked in a lot of different places, but how long does it take to build an app on Bubble? And there is absolutely no one answer to that. But even if you did say, like, hey, really, you should take no more than around 3 months to build your first version app. So we're adding some constraints in there. But with that, you have to consider how frequently and consistently you are personally committing time during that time frame. So are you spending hours, maybe a couple hours in your app every single day during that period? Or are you spending a couple hours once a week during that period? That's going to have a major influence on the overall time that it takes you to build your app, and thus, again, the cost, because we're assuming that you're spending money to get help along the way, right? So the longer it takes, the more it costs. But if you are consistently focusing time on building your skill set and building your app, you're going to build it a lot quicker and it's going to cost less money, because building your app and your skill set is kind of like going to the gym. If you take 3 weeks off from going to the gym when previously you were going consistently, right? You had developed a base level of fitness, then you don't go to the gym for 3 weeks and then you go back. And then you go and do those same exercises that you had been doing previously. All of them are going to feel harder and it's going to take you time to build back up. It's the same with building your app and your skill set. If you spend time developing this skill set and then you take 3 weeks off, for example, you're going to have to backtrack and rebuild what you've lost, because when you're just starting out, development is not going to feel intuitive to you. It's a new thing. And so you can't just come in, learn something, and then say, okay, it's in there forever. It's not going to be. So if you're not in your app consistently and frequently, it's going to take you longer. It's going to cost you more money. Now, the next one is one of the biggest ones of all, but what type of help are you getting? Now, we've kind of alluded to this throughout the video, but you can be building your app completely on your own, completely for free, other than your own time, which obviously is costing you something. But you could take that route, or you could take the route that I've mentioned a couple times, going through a program like the one that we offer, where it's really hands-on. You're guided every step of the way. Both are self-building, but both are vastly different, right? So when you're thinking about this, what type of help are you getting? You want to be looking at things like process. Is there a process you're following? Is there a structure you're following? Is there strategy that's being taken into account for how you're building what you're building? The order in which you're building what you're building. Is there development methodology coming into play? Are you following the right steps chronologically? Are you building to optimize for scale and performance? Because that's going to prevent a lot of backtracking as you go, which obviously expands the time frame. So all of these things are going to come into play and really affect the length of time that it takes you. And number 5 is one that I like to talk about, which might sound a little bit weird, but it's because nobody really thinks about this. But do you actually want to be building your app? Now, again, this might sound a little bit strange, but I see some people who feel like they are forced to build the app themselves just because they just can't afford to outsource. So they have to build the app themselves. And they don't want to be doing it, right? And so because they don't want to be doing it, every single step feels like a really big chore. Now, the thing about development is that it's full of puzzles and you have to figure a lot of things out along the way. It's a lot of tinkering, okay? And if you are coming up against those puzzles and those instances where you need to tinker and you do not want to be doing this, those are going to feel like mind-numbing challenges and frustrations to you. But if you actually do want to be building your app, you want to be building it so that, yeah, you can save a lot of money, but also so that you can have control over your app long term and so that you can develop a skill set that's going to enable you to do a lot of things for your business, right? If you actually want to be doing that, those kind of mind games, those puzzles, those tinkering moments, those aren't going to feel so much like frustrating challenges. They're going to feel like puzzles that usually are pretty engaging. If you're just building your app because you feel like you have no other option and you do not want to be doing it, it's going to take you a long time to build your app. And I would be willing to bet that at some point you're just going to choose to spend the money that you could have spent early on and get help doing it. Okay, but if you actually want to be doing this for other reasons besides just that you have to, then you're going to probably build your app a lot more quickly. And that's going to affect the cost. Okay, so the scope of your app, the complexity, the frequency and consistency at which you're actually in the app, the type of help you're getting, and whether or not you actually want to be doing this, all of those things need to be considered. You need to figure out what the answer is to each of those for you and for your app. And remember that they all affect each other too. And so what you really need to be figuring out when thinking about those is how long or not is it going to take you to build your app? Now, I'm going to give you a frame of reference. I want to see you building your first version app in about 3 months. That's like a sweet spot, okay? Any shorter is not really realistic, all right? But that's really a sweet spot. So put that on one end of your spectrum. Now, for reference, for people who just try to build themselves the entire way with no direct help from anyone, just by, maybe asking questions in forums over time or looking up free tutorials, I see a lot of people spending 1 to 2 years building their apps doing that. Now, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it might be a bad thing for you. So that's why I give that as an example. So we have a few months on one end and we have 1 to 2 years on the other end. You need to figure out these different factors that we've just talked through, to what end or what side that's going to push you towards. So figure out, are you on the shorter end because you're consistently in your app, building your skill set? Your scope is correct for a first version. It's not too complex or more complex than it really should be. And keep in mind, there's lots of ways to simplify things, and you always should be. So, all those things. What is it for you? Put yourself somewhere on that spectrum. That's going to influence cost. Okay, so now we need to consider one other factor, and this is the most important one of all, usually. And that is the quality of your app. What level of quality do you want? Do you want to be able to build a first version the first time through that will be able to evolve into your next version, next, and so on as your business as a whole evolves? Or do you want to potentially build your first version several times through and then not be able to build on top of that afterwards, but have to potentially rebuild because each time you try to scale, you run into performance issues? Okay, those are the things that you need to consider. Now, if you want a higher quality app and you're building it yourself, you're going to have to invest a lot more money, okay? I have seen people spend 1 to 2 years building their apps completely on their own, right? That far end of the spectrum that we talked about. And on the other side, they still couldn't launch a product that was truly scalable. So they had to go back and start over with paid help. Now, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The reason why I want to talk about that end of the spectrum is because some people like that. Some people like to tinker. They're not on some specific deadline, and that's fine. Okay, so that's often a choice. I don't see a lot of people struggle for that long without knowing that they're doing it intentionally. Okay, so before we start talking some numbers, let's do a quick recap. We have compared outsourcing versus self-building and a lot of the factors that come along with that, including cost, and then the development time frame that you're going to be looking at, which influences cost, of course. So that's the scope, the complexity, the frequency at which you're in your app, the type of help you're getting, and your own desire to be doing this. And then we've talked about the quality, which is obviously a major factor that you need to be considering. So now we're going to look at some things that you're probably not thinking of, but I want to coach you on how to approach being confident about pricing and choosing the right option. So when you start talking to teams or developers or coaches or whoever it may be about getting help building your app and how much it's going to cost you, you're going to get a very wide variety of answers and prices. Now, as we've gone through in this video, there's lots of different factors that are really personal that should decide which one is right for you. And so there isn't necessarily a right price or a wrong price, right? It just depends. And so, what we're going to talk through now is a way for you to figure out what it's worth to you to spend on your app and therefore be able to navigate all of those quotes in a way that's logical and that isn't going to leave you spending money kind of blindly. So there's two factors you need to think through before you go and talk to anyone. Number one is, what is the anticipated ROI, the return on investment that you are going to be getting from building your app? Now, if you can look financially first, then that would be helpful, but it's not required, which we'll get to. But have you validated your app idea? That's really what we're getting at here. It's okay if you don't have a specific number. If you can't come up with, the number of users you're going to have and the exact price point and therefore the annual revenue that you think you're going to have in year number 3, like that is okay. I don't expect you to have that, but I do expect you to have done some validating of your app idea. Generally, that's going to be in the form of you having personal experience with the problem that your app solves, the process that it involves, and just bringing your own knowledge and your own connections to that. Okay, so if you can kind of come up with a general idea or maybe even just a goal that you think is realistic, and you validated your idea, people have the problem that you're solving, and you have experience in solving it in another way, and you're just packaging that differently. If you have that, okay, great. But the second thing you need to add on to that is, what's the personal ROI? And to me, this is one of the most important things when it comes to building your app yourself. When you're outsourcing the development of your app, you have to go by that financial ROI to tell you whether or not it's worth it. And that's really hard, right? When you're building the app yourself, you can start to look at the personal ROI, which is sometimes even more valuable than the financial ROI. When you're building the app yourself, you have control over the app and you now have development skills. Now, what happens when you decide you want to pivot your app? Or maybe you want to pursue something new. Maybe you want to build your app, build it up to a certain annual revenue, bring on a team, and then go and build another one and do the same thing. Some of our own founders have done that, right? The personal ROI can be infinite, right? Because it just depends on how far you want to take it. It's completely up to you. So ask yourself, what is the best that could happen personally? Maybe that for you is being able to quit your job and run your own business forever. And that is your personal ROI. And you don't have a specific number, but you just know that for you, just being able to support yourself with your own thing, like that's it, right? You've done it. Or maybe the personal ROI for you is just being able to add some money to your retirement accounts. Great. Or maybe for you, the personal ROI is, at the very least, if you come out of this on the other end and your app idea is unfortunately not successful, it didn't end up being what you envisioned it being, you at least now have a development skill set and you can pursue another app idea if you want. Maybe you can contribute that skill set to your company and get a pay increase, if you're an employee. Maybe you're a business owner and your one app idea didn't pan out, but now you can systematize your business in a way that allows you to cut costs by 30% annually. I mean, at the very least, walking away with an in-demand skill set. maybe you end up building apps for other people. I've seen founders do that too, just because they love development that much, right? At the end of the day, your one app idea, if you're outsourcing, you're betting on that. But if you're building it yourself, that personal ROI can truly be whatever you want it to be, because again, it's however far you take it. Now, the reason why I emphasize this so much is because if you understand what this means, right? Investing your time and investing your money into your app. If you understand what it means for you personally and potentially also financially, then you can go into conversations with teams, developers, consultants with a lot of information and knowledge to help you make smart decisions. So if you talk to a developer and they say, I'm going to help you build your app over the next 8 weeks, and you're going to come out on the other side with a full scope app, and it's going to cost you $2,000, right? Well, you can look at that and compare that to maybe another quote you get where a developer says, I'm going to help you build your app, and on the other side, you're going to have the same scope, but it's going to cost you $10,000. Well, now you can start to ask questions, okay, about all the factors that we've talked about. And you can get information on the type of help that comes along with those things. You know, what's involved? What's the complexity? What's the quality? That's such a big one. And then you can understand which price is going to be worth it just for you personally. If you have thought through that personal ROI and you know that for you, it's not going to be worth more than maybe a few $1,000s for you to build your app yourself, right? Because maybe earlier on when we talked about how much you want to be building this, your desire is kind of low, right? If you go into conversations knowing that, then you're going to be able to make a smarter decision for you. That is probably a very wrong decision for someone else. So I'll wrap it up with this. For outsourcing, I've seen quotes from 2,000 to 50,000 for the same sort of product. There's going to be a lot of variation within that. So you have to think back to all of the factors that we talked through. What type of quality are you looking for? What is the complexity and the scope? And think of quality in relation to those things too. Think about your level of involvement that you want to be having, right? Do you have any desire at all to have any sort of role, right? On the lower end, you're going to need to be there a lot more. On the higher end, you can assume that you're not going to be needed for anything because everything's going to be systematized and, it's pretty much all taken care of. So what matters to you? You just got to prioritize it for yourself, and nobody can answer that for you. But after that, think about the ROI and then just make a decision based on that, right? Because that high end is not wrong and the low end is also not wrong. But it is wrong for some people, it's right for some people. And the same is true on the self-build side. I've seen quotes for consultants, for example, anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 and upwards, just depending on the length of time and what the scope ends up being. So again, think about the complexity, the quality relative to the scope. Your desire to be doing this, how much hand-holding you want or not. How much do you want to be figuring out your own process and your own strategy and your own methodology? You can find on the lower end someone who's just going to answer the questions or answer your questions as they come up, but you're the one who's figuring out which questions to ask. On that higher end, you don't need to worry about coming up with the right questions because they're already going to be pre-answered before you even have them. And then of course, that ROI. And with the self-build, it goes beyond the monetary ROI, and we're looking at personal ROI. Now, based on that cost, you have to think about the fact that on the higher end, where there's going to be a lot closer of a connection to the person who you're working with, a lot more structure, a lot more structured teaching, even, you're going to walk away with a skill set that's going to enable you to do a lot more and go a lot further. And on the lower end, obviously, the opposite is true. You're still going to be very, very reliant. Neither is right or wrong. It's just right or wrong for different people. So take all of these factors into account, figure them out for yourself before you go into these conversations, and then you can make the smart decision and the right decision for how much you should be spending to build your bubble app. Now, if you want to build your app yourself, but you want a high quality app, you want the structure, you want the process, you want to do it right the first time around, then the next thing to do from here is head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop, which is an in-depth training that's going to guide you through all the steps you need to take next to become a successful app entrepreneur. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop to sign up for that. We'll see you on the inside. And hey, I hope this was helpful. We'll see you in the next one.